Hello, and welcome to Chapter 16, Part 2. In this section, we're going to talk about the High Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, and the Late Renaissance. The High Renaissance is a very specific time period between around 1500 and 1525 in which the term the Renaissance man develops. And what that means is it is a versatile person. It's someone who is an artist, a scientist, a mathematician, an architect, many different things at once. And not only are they all these things at once, but they're very, very good at them. During this time, we're going to see a style of art that develops that is calm, balanced, and idealized. And we're going to see them use the elements and principles of art to achieve these ends. It's still a Christian community culture, but we're going to see them mix or reconcile the Christian theology with Greek philosophy and science of the day. So all these things are going to be taken into consideration when we're looking at the art of the High Renaissance. So we're going to look at several artists. The first is going to be Leonardo da Vinci. This is his Last Supper from 1495. And in it you can see a lot of those things that I was just talking about in terms of calm, balanced, and idealized. This was created on the wall of a monastery, and it was actually done in an experimental fresco method, which is why it's in such poor condition today. But we can still see the essentials of the painting. It's done in a very naturalistic way. You can see we have linear perspective, and the vanishing point is all going to draw us to the center point of the painting, which of course is Christ. You'll notice how Christ is laid out in an implied triangle. And then we have this really strong horizontal in front of him with all of the apostles behind the table. So it's like we're the audience, and we're looking at the scene. You can see that the apostles are clustered in groups of 3, and you can see that some of them are in implied triangles as well. And they're all trying to figure out who is going to betray Christ. He just told them that one of them is going to betray him. But Christ is kind of separate and very calm in this moment of upheaval. You can notice in the background we have 3 windows. These are symbolic of the Trinity, so the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the use of the diagonals here is only used to create the illusion of depth and space. So it's not really there to create drama or tension or movement or anything that we're going to see later on in the late Middle Ages. So we'll come back to this painting and compare it with some other ones as we go along. This is Madonna and Child with St. Anne from 1503 by Da Vinci. This particular painting was actually left unfinished. We do see a triangular composition here as well. So if you look at St. Anne, Madonna, and the Child here, you can see that they're grouped in a triangle. And you'll notice that we've got one fully grown woman sitting on the lap of another fully grown woman reaching for her child, which is not entirely realistic, but he was really trying to suggest meanings over being realistic. So this idea that they're all kind of one unit, there's a lineage there between, this is Mary's mother, Mary, and then Christ. And then you see that Christ is kind of holding on to this lamb as a symbol of his future sacrifice. In the background, you'll notice that we have this really barren landscape. That's there to symbolize the beginning of time. And then in terms of the sense of lighting, it's a technique called sfumato, which you have a gentle light that's been used, that uses translucent glazes to create this overall sense of lighting. This is the Mona Lisa from 1503. In it, you can see that we have that really detailed background behind her. You can see that she's in a kind of a triangular, if not pyramidal composition in the foreground. The use of light and dark here is pretty innovative and is introducing that technique of chiaroscuro that we've talked about, where the artist is using light and dark to reveal 3 dimensions. This is one of the first women that we see looking out of a painting, which is one of the reasons that it's so well known. It's also, an early portrait that we have, and portraiture was pretty unknown during the medieval period. So the fact that this is a portrait of a woman and she's looking out of the painting those are all very important aspects of this work. So moving on to Michelangelo, this is his David from 1501 to 1504. David, of course, was inspired by classical sculpture like Warrior A. Of course, this was found much later, but he was seeing images like this surrounded by it in Italy. And in it, you can see that there are several similarities. The idealized body type, the contrapposto, the way that he's standing with one arm straight, one arm bent, one leg straight, one leg bent, hips tilted and head turned, is very much like Warrior A. So we see those same things present in Warrior A. You may notice that the proportions are different. So he's not using those same classical proportions. So in other words, you can see how Warrior A, the hip line has been raised to divide the body directly in half, whereas the hip line here is much more realistic. So although the body of David is idealized, meaning that it is muscular, it's fit, it's youthful, there are proportions there that are much more realistic than idealized. Hopefully that makes sense. You may also notice how his hands have been exaggerated in terms of scale. So that is there to represent his power. So he's emphasizing that power of David. This is also showing the moment before David confronts Goliath, which is innovative. Normally when we see artwork from the Middle Ages or from Greek and Roman times, you're going to be seeing the moment that the action is happening. Whereas in the High Renaissance, a lot of the times it's this moment that's before the climax or the action that's going to take place. And so there's this buildup of tension within works like this. You'll also notice how his facial expression shows his youthful features, but also shows the concentration, almost the anger that's on his face. So we're going to see a lot more emotion present than we saw during the Middle Ages. This is the Sistine Chapel ceiling from 1508 to 12. He was actually forced by Pope Julius II to paint this. Michelangelo actually did not enjoy painting. He much more preferred to sculpt. It took him about 4 years to complete, which is actually really amazing when you look at the scale of these paintings. He would have painted this just inches away from it, so he would have been up on scaffolding on his back, basically on the ceiling, painting it. But it looks good from far away. So if you think about how difficult that would have been as well. Within the painting, you can actually see there's architectural framework within it. That is actually painted on and helps divide and unify the different paintings that are on the ceiling. Each segment is self-contained and depicts a biblical scene as well as mythological ones. So there's a mixture of Christian imagery with more classical mythological scenes. There are nude youths. These are called ignudos, and you can see them kind of throughout the paintings, and they serve as kind of transitional areas between the scenes that are being shown. The figures that we see within the Sistine Chapel ceiling have that same kind of anatomical fullness of the statues that Michelangelo created. So remember that during this time we have artists studying anatomy. So not necessarily painting just what they want to see, but really studying how the musculature fits, underneath the skin, how the bone structure works. All of these things are actually being studied by these artists. So we're going to take a closer look at this panel, The Creation of Adam, from 1511. So in it, you can see what I was talking about, about the kind of anatomical fullness of the figures, very muscular, very idealized, but more realistic than classical sculpture or painting. In this piece, we can see that Adam is pretty listless. He's just kind of reclining back, and he's kind of stretching his arm out almost lazily towards God on the other side. And you can see that God is reaching towards him, getting ready to breathe life into Adam. So again, we see this moment before something is going to happen. And all the action is getting ready to take place. So again, this moment full of tension, and that's increased by having this little bitty negative space in between the figures. So that sense of tension and drama is included. Now you'll notice on God's right hand side, he's got his other arm around a female figure here. This is Eve, and then he's got his hand on Christ. So he's kind of foreshadowing things to come in the Bible. So not only was Michelangelo a sculptor and a painter, he was also an architect. This is St. Peter's Basilica from 1546 to 64. So this is much later than the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and it was actually began when Michelangelo was in his 70s, and it was commissioned by Pope Paul III. In this building, you can see that it is centralized, but it also has a cross plan. So that centralized plan that we would have seen in the Byzantine era, and then the cross plan that we would have seen throughout the High Middle Ages, is actually merged together. We do have classical elements such as the dome, and then you also have columns with Corinthian capitals, as well as pillars. That's a Roman feature. So a lot of classical influence to this building. So moving on to Raphael, this is Pope Leo X with two cardinals from 1518. So he was a contemporary of Michelangelo, but actually kind of a little bit younger than both Michelangelo and Da Vinci. In this work, we can see a portrait of Pope Leo X and with two cardinals, and he's seated before a manuscript. You can see that he's got a little magnifying glass in his hand. He looks very naturalistic, so he has not been idealized. He's not like this very muscular, youthful figure. He's probably much like he looked in real life, and that was shown as a form of flattery. A form of showing the power of the Pope, rather than, idealizing him and making him seem younger or more youthful. Showing him as he actually was a way to convey his power. So he was a collector of books and created a fine library, and that's why we see him before a book. He wanted to be recognized as a great reader. This is the School of Athens. This was done at the same time as Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. In it, we're seeing Plato and Aristotle in the middle here, and they're in a classical setting. We can see that linear perspective is being used, with the vanishing point coming right to the middle, the two most important figures, and then the other groups here kind of symmetrically placed around them. All talking and discussing perhaps philosophy or other important learned subjects among these knowledgeable people. So there's actually an idealization here of philosophical discussion among learned people. So that was something that the Renaissance artists really admired and wanted to see come back in their own culture. This is the Tempest by Giorgione from 1505. We don't really know the iconography or the symbolism within this painting, but what's important is the composition and the landscape. So the figures here are kind of pushed off to the sides. You can see the two figures here kind of in a triangle, but pushed off to the sides. And what we're really focusing on, and in fact, the name of the painting is The Tempest, so we're really focusing on this storm that's going on in the background and that beautiful landscape that he's created. So the landscape was composed first, and the figures were then added, and really this paved the way for landscape painting. The figures are shown in contemporary clothing, um, and the weather conveys energy and movement. So even though it's pretty stable composition, we still have this energy and movement being shown by the storm in the background. This is Fête Champré by Titian from 1511. And this one we see another one where we have a landscape that's been painted beautifully in the background. The landscape here kind of evokes the mood of the painting. And this is not a depiction of actual people or actual events, but really more about these poets that are seated with these nude females, and these nude females are representative of muses, so being their inspirations. So they're not actually, seated with these nude females. Those are just symbols of being a muse or being inspiration for the poets that are shown in more contemporary clothing. This is another work by Titian, Pesaro Madonna. Pesaro refers to the family that commissioned this piece, and you can see that this is on a wall, and it was actually cut to fit around the pillars and the archway. Within it, we see a clear hierarchy, Madonna being at the top of the triangle, and then, of course, Christ being right next to her. In it, we can see this color red becomes very famous. It's called Titian red, and it's known to be by this artist. So this artist developed this color of red. We can see that he's actually using diagonal lines quite a bit here. So it's a triangle, but you can see that the triangle is more diagonal on one side and kind of straight down on the other side. And then we see diagonals in the background as well. So we're starting to see more diagonals being used rather than just horizontals to create that really stable composition. Also, the fact that we have an interior with an exterior scene is pretty typical of the Renaissance. A couple more by Titian. This is the portrait of Ranuccio Farnese from 1542. So Titian was a sought-after portraitist, and in this one we can see that Titian red again, and he's really conveyed the sense of kind of shyness or naivete shown in the boy that's being represented, but then he's clothed in these really fine clothes. You can see that he's got a sword, and it feels very heavy on the child. So there's this combination there of showing, of course, what the parents probably wanted, which is showing him as this rich and powerful person, but then also showing his kind of endearing shyness that's coming through on the face of the child. Lastly, by Titian, this is the Annunciation from 1560. As he aged and got older, and we move more into the, later into the 16th century, we're going to see his style change. We're going to see looser brushstrokes. So when I say looser brushstrokes, let's compare it. Let's go back. You can see in this one, you don't see any brushstrokes. Everything is very smooth and refined, whereas in this one, it feels a little bit softer, a little bit looser. You're going to see more subdued color. You still see that Titian red though, right? And then this is celebrating heavenly glory. So what we're seeing is the Annunciation, the moment where Mary is being told by an angel that she is going to have Christ. You can see this little dove coming down kind of as a symbol of heavenly splendor. Notice the emotion that's present on the faces. Very dramatic scene. So we're seeing the moment of the drama happening, which is a little bit different from what we've seen before. She's kind of turning around in this shocked, gesture, her arm flying up. She's surprised to see the angel, and it's very apparent that of the emotions that are going on within the scene. We'll come back to this painting and talk a little bit more about it in the later Renaissance. So now we're going to move up to the north. And the Renaissance in the north, we're talking about the northern countries, Switzerland, Germany, northern France, and the Netherlands. And really, we're going to see different characteristics than Italy, and that is because they're not surrounded by the classical ruins that we would have seen in Italy. So we're going to see them more gradually evolve out of the Middle Ages and really become concerned with the details of the world and representing them accurately. So things are going to be really kind of minutely detailed within the Northern Renaissance. So this is a piece by the Limburg brothers from 1416. It's a calendar, and it's for the month of February. It's rendered in a lot of detail. So you can look and you can see, you can count the amount of birds that are present. You can count the sheep that are in this little barn here. We're seeing what we call a cutaway wall or cutaway roof style, where we're actually seeing inside the house. So this house, it looks like it's missing a wall, but it's really just showing us what's on the interior of the house. So we can see these figures kind of warming themselves before the fire. You can see beehives and a man cutting trees in the background, another man with a donkey kind of going towards this really detailed town. So there's a lot going on within this very tiny artwork. It's only 9 inches high. So it's showing us there's this new interest in the natural world and showing the detail of everything in the natural world. It's one of the first winter landscapes that we have. And we'll continue to see this kind of detail and interest in natural world as we go on. Now you will notice that it is using a perspective, but the perspective is not scientific and not like we would have seen in the Italian Renaissance. So look at how dramatic this perspective is, and you have another vanishing point over here. So there's kind of a mixture of viewpoints being shown, and it's not going to be as scientifically rendered as we would have seen in the Italian Renaissance. So this is the Marode altarpiece by Robert Campin from 1416. And in it, we're seeing a depiction of the Annunciation. So we just saw a Titian work that was portraying that same subject matter, Christian subject matter. And this is done in a very different manner, so let's compare the two. So in the Titian piece, you can see it's all about kind of the drama of the moment, the loose brush strokes, the emotion on the faces. Whereas in the Campin piece, you can see it's much more about kind of the detail being shown. Mary really isn't even aware of the angel's presence yet. So there's not that drama, there's not that emotion being shown, but more kind of a focus on detail and iconography within the work. So if we take a closer look at the triptych, it's a triptych. So when it has 3 panels like that, that's what we call a triptych. On the left-hand side, we're seeing the donors for the painting. In the middle, we're seeing the Annunciation. And then on the right, we're seeing Joseph in his carpentry studio. So every object in this work has a symbolic meaning. So if we look in the middle here, we can see we see a lily, we see an extinguished candle, we see a Bible open, we see white linens hanging up here. These things, actually, the white lilies and the white linens represent Mary's purity. There's a cross that's being carried towards Mary, which represents the divine impregnation. And even in the image with Joseph, there's a mousetrap that's being shown, and that is a symbol of Jesus trapping the devil. So each one of these, objects has a meaning and has a further symbol. If you look at the drapery and the way the drapery is being shown, it reminds us of the Middle Ages, where it has that kind of flattened, ironed look to it. We saw that commonly in the Middle Ages. So you can see how it's growing out of the Middle Ages rather than just going straight to being influenced by classical art. This is St. Luke drawing the Virgin by Rogier van der Weyden from 1435. And really, again, this one's about looking at the detail. We see the figures in the foreground, and it's balanced against this really beautiful landscape in the background. But there's a minute detail that's present. So if you look at there's patterning on the tile, there's this pattern on the tapestry behind. Everything is extremely detailed, and you're meant to notice all of those details. We see Mary feeding her child, and you can see the kind of love and the expression on her face, and the child kind of looking up at Mary. So there is emotion being shown, much more subtle than we would have seen during the late Renaissance, or the later Renaissance. This is the Isenheim altarpiece by Grunwald from 1515. The Northern Renaissance not only focused on detail, but sometimes on gruesome detail. And so that's what we're seeing in here in this work. This was originally in a hospital devoted to skin disease. And you can see by looking at the image of Christ here that he's in extreme pain. He's emaciated. His hands are kind of reached out in pain. His skin, if you look closely, you can see that there's lesions all over it, which is appropriate for it being in a hospital for skin disease. So they made it so that the people who were going to see it could actually relate to it, but at the same time were shocked by the kind of gruesome detail that's present. Albrecht Dürer was an artist who worked in the Northern style, but also kind of fused it with Italian Renaissance standards and was very influential in the Northern Renaissance. This is the Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513, and in it he's combining Christian symbols with familiar subjects in the Flemish tradition. You can look closely, you can see the amount of detail present, but you also notice how everything is done very naturalistically. I have a few more to show you by Albrecht Dürer in which you can see what I'm talking about. So if you look, let's look at the Adam and Eve here. You can see that the figures are much more like we would have seen in the Italian Renaissance, being idealized, the musculature being shown. But then the amount of detail, like you can see every leaf on this tree, every curl of her hair, that amount of detail is associated with the Northern Renaissance. So there's that combination of the two within the work of Albrecht Dürer. This is the Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger from 1533. He was the court painter to Henry VIII. In it we see, of course, portraiture, but then we also have all of these objects that are on the shelves that the men are leaning on, and all of these objects have a symbolism. There's symbols of the four human sciences, which were music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. But then you have this rug that kind of symbolizes the connection with the wider world. You can see on this lute here, there's actually a broken string, and that's actually a symbol of the Reformation that was going on. The Reformation was a break with the Catholic Church and trying to reform the Catholic Church because they considered it to be very corrupt. Now, you might notice that there's something that I haven't mentioned, which is this strange amorphic shape. And when you look at it from the bottom left, you can actually see that that is a human skull. So it kind of reminds us of those Vanitas paintings, which come later, but have that sense of, you know, there's all of these splendors of life, the human sciences, we have religion. But then, you know, there's that reminder of death and that coming mortality of humans. So there's the celebration of human life and achievements, but still reminds us of death. And the Reformation in general is going to lead to less religious imagery and more everyday scenes. So this is The Harvesters by Peter Bruegel the Elder from 1565, in which we're seeing just a common everyday working people harvesting the crops. And the landscape here is really the principal theme. If we compare it to the piece by the Limburg brothers, you can see that there is a broader sense of a composition as well as more spatial depth. So you can see, the background, we have the atmospheric perspective being used. It appears to go further into a deep space than the Limburg brothers piece, but similar themes in the sense that we're seeing common everyday working people, using their farm equipment and living their daily lives. So that's going to lead us to the late Renaissance. And the death of Raphael in 1520 signaled the beginning of the end of the Renaissance. And a style called Mannerism is going to grow out of the Renaissance. So we're going to look at a couple pieces of Mannerist works. This is the Allegory, or just Allegory, by Bronzino from 1545. It has a pretty obscure meaning based in Roman mythology, I believe. And you really have to be educated in Roman mythology to know exactly what's going on here. There's an erotic undertone and kind of an odd coupling, very odd coupling. This is Venus and this is her son Cupid. So kind of an interesting relationship being revealed there between Venus and Cupid. If you look at the way this is composed, all the figures are kind of forced to the front of the composition. There's no deep space. And there's this kind of artificial, kind of self-conscious quality to the figures. So it's much less naturalistic in terms of composition and the expressions on the faces. We have the Entombment by Pontormo from 1525. And in this one, we can see a shift away from those bold colors that we saw with the Renaissance, more to pastel colors. Dramatic shifts in values from lights to darks, like for example you can see here. There's also not really you can't really tell exactly where the light's coming from. So like from here it's coming from above, here it's coming from the left. So all different kind of light sources within there. Again, we have the figures that are kind of pushed together, crowded into kind of an ambiguous sense of space and a chaotic composition. And the emotions that are being shown are kind of over the top. And look posed. So really, this is defying some of the rules of the Renaissance, such as the natural proportions. So you can see the figures here. If you look at her legs or his legs, you can see how short they are compared to his torso. The figures kind of become elongated in some sense. So non-classical proportions as well. So this is a work by Sofonisa Aguisola. She is the first woman to achieve recognition and really become famous during her lifetime. This work is a portrait of Amilcar, Minerva, and Asdrubal Aguisola, so her family members. Here we can see there's a feeling of family interaction between the figures. It's kind of a more informal feel to it. This actually was left unfinished. You can see here, for example, because she left to become the court painter to Spain. So she was very, very successful within her time period. Okay, so the last work that we're going to look at in this chapter is The Last Supper by Tintoretto from 1592 to 94. So we opened up this lecture with The Last Supper, and we're going to close it with The Last Supper. During the Counter-Reformation, which happened in the 16th and 17th century, art was one of the strongest weapons that they had, and this was an effort to kind of bring people back to the Catholic Church. And Tintoretto is one of those artists that they were utilizing to create images to bring people back to the Catholic Church. This was influenced by Titian's late work. So if we compare these two, you can see similarities such as this flare of light that kind of happens towards the middle of the composition in both. In this case, it's the halo of Christ. You can see figures flying up above in both of them. So you can see definitely some similarities between the two. Now let's take a closer look at this, and you can see that the brushwork is also similar to Titian's in the sense that it's looser. You also have really dramatic lighting. So for example, if you look at any of these figures, but if we look at Christ, you see light to dark, very dramatic lighting. We also have the diagonal being used as opposed to the horizontals that we saw in the earlier piece by Da Vinci. So if we compare these two, you get a sense this one has much more kind of chaos going on. You can see, a maid in the foreground washing dishes, passing off to another servant here, and then all of the apostles are, except for Judas, are on one side of the table. So there's this real separation between who is going to betray Christ and the rest of the apostles. Whereas in the Da Vinci piece, we can see that that is not the case. So all of the apostles and Christ are on one side of the table. The table is horizontal. All of the figures are kind of being presented to us very formally in a calm and balanced way. Whereas in the Tintoretto piece, everything is diagonal, everything is chaotic. We have this dramatic sense of lighting. So everything that was internal and subtle has become exaggerated and emotional here. And that is going to lead us into the Baroque period, which we will talk about in chapter 17.